25 October 1944 before sunrise. Off the coast of Samar. The ocean is quiet in that strange way the Pacific sometimes becomes just before something violent tears it open again. Low, clouds hang like a gray curtain. Warm tropical air sits heavy on the skin. Salt mist clings to steel, and far to the east, faint thunder of distant guns rolls along the wind like a warning, but it isn't thunder. It's the echo of battleships. On the small, underarmed U.S. escort carrier task group called Taffy 3, sailors move slowly across decks, rubbing tired eyes as night shifts end. They believe the main Japanese fleet has been lured far away to the north. They trust Admiral Halsey is blocking the path. No one here expects to see heavy Japanese forces. Not here, not now. Just beyond the horizon, the destroyer USS Johnston cuts a light wake through the still water. Her bridge windows are still dark. Most men are just waking. They think this morning will be like yesterday. They think there will be no surprises. And in a few minutes, they will see a sight so massive and so impossible that Japanese pilots themselves will later describe what followed as unbelievable. To understand the shock that Japanese pilots felt that morning when a single American destroyer refused to die, you have to understand how desperate Japan was in 1944 and how bold their final strategic gamble had become. In the summer and fall of 1944, Japan was not simply losing the Pacific, it was collapsing. The Mariana Islands had fallen. Saipan was gone. Tinian and Guam were gone. The U.S. submarine blockade was strangling raw materials and fuel. The Imperial Navy, once the most feared carrier aviation force on the planet, had been bled white. In October 1944, almost every Japanese admiral alive knew a bitter truth. If America captured the Philippines and cut Japan off from Borneo oil, the war was mathematically finished. So Tokyo approved one final gigantic operation. They called it Operation Shogo 1. In Japanese, Sho meant victory. But the plan wasn't built to defeat America in the strategic sense. It was built to produce one giant, dramatic outcome that could psychologically stun the U.S. and maybe force negotiations. Japan's thinking was brutal yet simple. Strike the U.S. Navy at Leyte Gulf with everything left. Destroy the amphibious fleets, slaughter the U.S. invasion force, and hope Washington recoiled in shock. It didn't matter if Japanese ships survived the operation. It didn't matter if nothing returned home. This was a final roll of every remaining dice. So the Japanese High Command built a three-pronged strike. The southern force would move up from the south to attack Leyte. The northern force with the last remaining aircraft carriers would act as a decoy to pull Admiral Halsey's powerful American Third Fleet away. The center force, the most important, would sweep through San Bernardino Strait and crush the thin American escort carriers protecting the landing beaches. That center force was terrifying on paper. It contained battleships, heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and destroyers. And in that force was Yamato, the largest warship ever built by any nation in history. She carried 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval guns ever mounted on any battleship in human history. If center force reached those beaches, the small escort carriers there, the jeep carriers and their thin destroyer screens would be slaughtered. So the Americans placed Admiral Halsey and his fast carriers to the north. Their job was to stand guard. Their job was to block that passage. But Halsey saw the Japanese northern force. He believed it was the main body. And he sprinted away with his carriers to destroy them. This opened a gap. This left the San Bernardino Strait unguarded. And in the early morning darkness of 25 October 1944, Admiral Kurita led the entire Central Japanese strike group. The battleships, the cruisers, everything straight through, and now those ships. The biggest guns Japan had were crawling out of the morning fog and smoke, bearing down directly on one tiny American covering force. Taffy, 3 6-baby escort carriers, 3 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts. No heavy armor, no heavy guns, no fast carriers, no battleships, no cruisers. These were not the giants of the U.S. Navy, these were the smallest. These were the ships built to escort slow-moving helicopters and convoys, not go toe-to-toe with the last samurai of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Americans on those decks, waking up with coffee and cigarettes and a quiet morning routine, had absolutely no idea that dozens of Japanese ships were right there, steaming right at them. When the first spotting aircraft from the carriers finally pierced the haze and made visual contact, one pilot couldn't believe what he was seeing. He reported back shaking, voice cracking with disbelief. What he saw directly in front of him was the nightmare scenario every U.S. fleet commander had tried to prevent for 3 years. Japan's entire remaining surface strike force was about to collide with the weakest American naval unit in the Philippines, and at the absolute center of that impossible upcoming collision was a destroyer with hull number DD-557, a ship barely 376 feet long, a ship with 5-inch guns that should not even scratch battleship armor, USS Johnston. And this is where the world bends. This moment right here sets up the most improbable naval confrontation of the Pacific War. A single tiny American destroyer, built small, built light, built to escort, would soon turn toward the largest battleships ever placed on the ocean. And instead of running, it would charge. To understand how insane the numbers were that morning, you need to understand what the ships of Taffy 3 were and what they were not. Taffy 3 was led by Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague. His core strength was 6 CVE's escort carriers. They were not fast carriers like Enterprise or Essex. They were converted merchant hulls with slow engines, thin steel, and tiny air wings of composite fighters and torpedo bombers. They existed to support ground troops, not dual battleships. Each one carried around 24 aircraft. That's it. Their flight decks were so narrow and so fragile that even minor hits could tear them open. Below them floated their bodyguards, 3 Fletcher-class destroyers, Johnston, Hoel, Heermann, and 4 destroyer escorts were even lighter, even more fragile, including Samuel B. Roberts. One sailor would later describe destroyer escorts as tin cans echoing hull plating, so thin a single battleship shell could cut them in half. These ships were never meant to fight big gun surface action. They were the little ones now. Look at the Japanese force on the other side of the horizon that morning. Yamato, 18.1-inch guns. Nagato, 16-inch guns. Kongo, 14-inch guns. Haruna, 14-inch guns. 7 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers. This wasn't just a bigger force. This was the most powerful surface strike group Japan had in 1944. It had more big guns than any naval force on Earth that day. Japanese officers had been drilled for decades in the doctrine of decisive battle, the idea that one massive crushing victory could break America's will. They fully believed that if they could smash these American ships near Leyte, the United States would hesitate, pause, maybe even doubt the entire island-hopping strategy, and they finally had a target. When Kurita's lookout spotted masts and flight decks in the distance, the reaction inside the Japanese flagship was a blend of shock and elation. They did not expect to find American carriers here. They believed these were fleet carriers, not little escort CVEs. For a short moment, the Japanese brass thought the gods had handed them the opportunity they had dreamed of since Pearl Harbor. Kill U.S. carriers in a single blow, now return to the American side. Sprague had almost nothing to protect himself. No battleships, no heavy cruisers, no big guns. All he had were the destroyers, Johnston, Hoel, Heermann, and those destroyer escorts. And that is where the USS Johnston stands starkly in the center of this story. Because Johnston had been built aggressively, she wasn't an escort-converted ship. She was a purpose-built Fletcher destroyer. Among destroyers, these were some of the most balanced and lethal designs of the war. Fast, maneuverable, with 5 5-inch guns that could fire fast enough to put down a wall of steel. But 5-inch guns versus Yamato's 18.1-inch guns. That's like a man with a pocket knife taking on a sledgehammer swung by a giant. It wasn't a fight, it wasn't a duel, it was suicide. At 06:37, American scouts confirmed the truth. The Japanese center force was right there. It was too late to run, too late to hide. Sprague ordered the carriers to turn east and run away while launching every aircraft they had, even if they weren't armed, even if they only had machine guns. And in that chaos, with flight decks scrambling, pilots sprinting to planes, gunnery officers screaming bearings, one destroyer captain, Swemdeer Ernest E. Evans aboard USS Johnston, saw the impossible sea of battleships and cruisers bearing down, and instead of waiting for orders, he simply turned his ship directly toward them. He accelerated into the mouth of the largest Japanese surface fleet in the Pacific, he accelerated so hard that sailors were thrown to the deck. No American commander in that battle would make a more shocking decision in the next 2 hours, and this is the factual moment from which everything becomes legend. From this moment forward, the Japanese pilots who later witnessed what Johnston did would never forget it, because what happens next when Stevenson's little destroyer flung herself at Yamato and cruisers and battleships practically rewrote everything anyone thought they knew about what a tin can could do. Human reality on board a tin can. Destroyer sailors in WW2 lived in a strange psychological world. They served on the smallest gunships in the fleet, but they were also the closest to the fight. Fletcher-class decks were narrow. Passageways were tight. A single hit could gut them open like a fish, everyone knew it. Destroyer crewmen were never protected by the psychological buffer of armor. They lived daily with the understanding that if the big shells ever reached them, there was nothing between their bodies and a steel fragment except a sheet of thin hull plating. On bigger ships, sailors often believed in the ship's mass. They felt safe in the tonnage. Destroyer sailors never did. They lived daily knowing the truth. Speed was their armor. Aggression was their shield. If they hesitated, they died. If they paused, they died. In the Pacific, destroyer crews developed a culture bordering on reckless, not stupid recklessness, but the kind of aggressive instinct that comes from knowing they existed to hunt, strike, and then disappear. So when Evans ordered Johnston to turn toward the enemy, the men did not freeze in disbelief. It made horrible, perfect sense, because every destroyer sailor knew a terrifying truth. Their job was to throw themselves between the enemy and something weaker. And there was nothing weaker than the escort carriers. Behind them, this was not heroic poetry, this was a procedure. This was logic. This was the destroyer's role. The men on board Johnston didn't have time to philosophize. Their world compressed instantly into immediate mechanics. Get ammunition to the guns, set firing solutions, spin torpedo tubes, get range, get bearings, get shells on target. Sailors sprinted, shirtless ammunition handlers carried shells in lines that looked like human conveyor belts. Men in the engine rooms pushed the boilers to pressures the ship wasn't rated for, and all of this happened in seconds. Destroyers were never asked to hold the line. They were asked to go forward, hit hard, and die if necessary. That was the human baseline. That was the psychological environment. And that is why Johnston's first decision to turn toward the battleships was not an absurd fantasy moment. It was the exact job the destroyer community already understood they existed, for which leads into the next angle, what the Americans were supposed to do against a battleship and how this was the opposite. The tactical logic of a destroyer charge. The U.S. Navy had a very clear doctrine in the 1940s. Destroyers should not duel battleships with gunfire. They cannot trade blows. They die. The true offensive weapon of a destroyer was not the 5-inch guns. It was the torpedo battery, American. Destroyers in 1944 carried the Mark 15 torpedo, a long, fast, armor-killing weapon that could destroy any warship afloat. Torpedoes were the equalizer, but torpedoes had brutal launch rules. You had to close the distance. You had to get close enough to get a solution. You had to run into the teeth of enemy fire. So in destroyer training, when facing a larger surface force, the tactic was always accelerate toward the enemy, launch torpedoes, then turn away at full speed. Destroyer combat was always designed to look suicidal from the outside. That was doctrine. It was called a torpedo attack run. This is why, when Evans turned Johnston toward the Japanese line, he wasn't being crazy. He was doing the exact thing destroyers were built to do. The Japanese ships were enormous, and they were exactly the kind of targets torpedoes were meant to kill. So in pure Navy tactical logic, Evans had no other choice. He had to attack. What made Johnston's run unique was not that it attacked. What made it unique was that it attacked alone, without waiting for tactical synchronization with the other destroyers, because Evans understood a horrifying detail. If he waited one more minute, the Japanese guns would start landing shells on the escort carriers that could not be allowed. Torpedoes do not work if the enemy is allowed to fire at what you are protecting. So Johnston became the point of the Spear not because Evans was reckless but because the clock forced him into initiating the run immediately. He understood a simple fact. A destroyer's torpedoes meant nothing if the carriers died before they launched. He was buying time. He was creating chaos in the Japanese firing solution. That was tactical rationality. Japanese naval officers were trained to evaluate enemy ships by size, armament, and silhouette. They respected tonnage, they respected armor, they respected gun diameter. When they saw the escort carriers, they assumed these were CVs, fleet carriers. Large, powerful, armored. When they saw the destroyers, they did not see capital ship killers. They saw throwaway vessels. They saw cannon fodder. So when Johnston suddenly accelerated straight toward their line, not turning away, not laying down smoke to retreat, Japanese officers were stunned because this was not in the American behavioral pattern they had studied. American destroyers usually worked in coordinated packs. They usually attacked with other destroyers. They usually stayed in formation. This one didn't. It charged alone, and that dislocated everything. It broke their mental model of American destroyer doctrine. More importantly, Japanese officers suddenly realized that this destroyer wasn't laying smoke to hide. It was laying smoke to blind the Japanese gunners from seeing the carriers behind. And this enemy destroyer was not firing warning shots. Its first salvos were precise. Its rise times were perfect. The rate of fire was shockingly fast. So fast that some Japanese lookouts thought they were being hit by multiple ships. Right here at this moment, Japanese pilots circling above would start transmitting urgent reports about an American destroyer fighting beyond normal doctrine. They didn't have any other phrase for it. This is exactly the moment where the shock first begins. Japanese naval aviation in WW2 was built on a deeply rigid code. They studied, memorized, and internalized the decisive battle concept Kantai Kessen. It was the central doctrine that the entire Imperial Navy was built for. They believed that the United States would eventually come into one final giant surface battle, where big guns would exchange fire at long range, and victory would be earned by superior gunnery and superior courage. They had prepared for this since the 1920s. So, the Japanese pilots flying surveillance arcs over Samar that morning were not just watching another firefight. They believed they were witnessing part of that long-awaited decisive battle. And when they saw a single destroyer hurl itself directly toward battleships, it destabilized them. Japanese culture in 1944 associated self-sacrifice charge primarily as a Japanese trait. They believed they were the ones who threw their bodies at impossible odds. And here, in front of their eyes, an American tin can was doing it. They would later write that it felt upside down. They had expected American caution, American distance, American fire discipline, American risk calculation. What they were seeing was an American ship behaving like a samurai who had already accepted death and was now choosing how many giants he would kill before the end. That inversion, that role reversal created the emotional shock point, scrambled their assumptions. Japanese pilots were watching a moment where the enemy had become the fanatic, and that cracked the psychological foundation they had believed in for years. Inside Johnston's Combat Information Center, there was no poetry, there was no dramatic soundtrack. There was only mechanical violence and calculated range. Math. Radar operators were calling out bearings faster than officers could. Scribble shell splashes were walking closer. A Japanese cruiser was now less than 10 miles away. This was lethal range. Officers were calling solutions and corrections. Gun captains rotated barrels. Radarmen shouted adjustments. Every man inside that CIC understood the math perfectly. The longer Johnston stayed alive, the more chaos she forced into the Japanese firing solutions, and the more survivors behind her would escape. Time itself became a weapon. Every 30 seconds, she was not dead was a direct strategic victory. There was no fantasy in that destroyer warfare was math. Evans' decision was not mystical courage, it was ruthless application of the one tactical advantage he still had left. Speed, Johnston's hull, engines, and rudder were the last remaining variables he could exploit to bend time in the U.S. Navy's favor. And so they accelerated, they pushed boilers to the edge of the red line. They absorbed every shock through adrenaline. Inside that CIC, there was no illusion they would survive. The question was no longer, can we win? The question was now, how long can we keep them busy? Every second counted. Modern naval academies, American, Japanese, and European still study Taffy 3, not because of romance, because it shattered a false assumption many navies still had in mid-20th century thinking. The assumption was, only big ships decide wars. Only big guns matter. Tonnage, and destiny. But Johnston proved something frightening. A ship with almost no armor, if captained with aggressive clarity, can paralyze a force vastly larger than itself. Because warfare isn't just metal, war is psychology. In the Battle off Samar, Johnston forced the Japanese fleet to slow down, retarget, redivide fire, and reposition. She shattered their momentum. She disrupted their plan. She forced the enemy commander to focus emotionally and tactically on a single destroyer instead of the strategic target of the carriers. This is why modern naval officers still cite this moment. It is not nostalgia. It's a tactical case study showing that small platforms can have disproportionate impact when used offensively at the exact critical moment. Johnston weaponized shock. Johnston weaponized surprise. Johnston weaponized the last thing she had left, the will to close the distance, and this sets the stage for what happens. Next, the moment where torpedoes start flying. Japanese cruisers take hits, and the most improbable single-ship attack run of the Pacific reaches the point where steel finally meets steel. The final pieces of the picture lock together. Japanese battleships now fully clear the haze. Main batteries elevate. Rangefinders track targets. The escort carriers behind Johnston are running for their lives. Evans doesn't wait for permission. He orders flank speed. Johnston surges forward. The horizon ahead becomes a black wall of muzzle flashes as Japanese cruisers open fire. Shells whistle over her mast and crash into the ocean, throwing columns of water higher than the destroyer's bridge. Johnston keeps accelerating. Gun crews brace, adjust elevation, and begin feeding ammunition in a continuous rhythm. The first salvos of 5-inch shells spit fire from Johnston's gunhouses. They streak out across the water toward a Japanese cruiser. The first few rounds land short, then the next bracket locks. In 5-inch hits start landing. Observers later testified they saw Japanese plating begin to spark and peel from the cruiser's bow. But Evans needs more than gunfire. He needs to get close enough to launch torpedoes. Johnston angles to port, cutting inside the Japanese firing arc. This is the most terrifying part of a torpedo run. You have to close into the enemy's kill zone. Japanese battleships now have firing solutions. Yamato herself starts lining up. Her 18.1-inch guns begin cycling. Each shell weighs like a small automobile. If even one lands anywhere on Johnston's hull, the destroyer is gone instantly. But Johnston keeps running in. Evans calls out the range. $1,000. Yards, 7,500.7 thousand. He waits. Waiting means shells are landing closer. Waiting means trusting your helmsman's hands. Waiting means the boilers are screaming. But launching torpedoes too early means missing entirely. One destroyer man later recalled, "Every second we got closer was a second we thought might be our last." Johnston now closes to torpedo range. Evans gives the order, torpedoes away. 10 Mark 15s leave their tubes and spread out. They race across the sea at 46 knots at Evans orders immediate, evasive maneuvering. Johnston zigzags, increasing speed again, using her hull to generate precious seconds of blurred profile. Japanese radar loses precise lock. Momentarily, Johnston lays smoke to obscure the carriers behind her and to break line of sight on her own hull on the Japanese flagship. Lookouts shout new alarms. Torpedoes spotted. Panic ripples. The entire Japanese line begins to turn. This was never part of the Japanese plan. They expected American ships to run, not to attack. And here was a single destroyer charging like a bull directly into them. The lead heavy cruiser Kumano takes a torpedo hit near the bow. A shockwave rips into her forward magazines. Her bow is blown open so violently that the ship almost breaks apart. Kumano staggers out of formation, bow ruined, speed falling, guns silenced. One tiny destroyer has just crippled a major Japanese cruiser. This forces the Japanese column to slow again to adjust formation shift priority. Time is bleeding away. And every second that passes is another second the tiny U.S. escort carriers are escaping eastward. Evans's gamble is working. He bought time. He bought confusion. He forced an entire wing of the Japanese surface fleet to react, to turn, to rethink. And Johnston is still alive. The Japanese turn their rage on her. Shellfire intensifies. Secondary batteries begin walking shots closer. Lookouts aboard escort carrier. Gambier Bay watch Johnston through binoculars. A tiny shape swallowed in towering walls of water and flame. A pilot overhead radios back to his carrier. That destroyer's charging them alone. Another voice. Stunned. That's impossible. But it's happening. Evans now points Johnston back toward the enemy again because he knows something. One torpedo spread isn't enough. He must keep them busy. He must keep them angry. He must keep them firing at him. If Japan's guns are pointed at Johnston, they are not pointed at the carriers. Every second the carriers are not hit is a second earned. But now the Japanese are no longer confused. They are furious. Shell splashes. Titan proximity shells begin bursting overhead. 730, a large caliber shell finds Johnston's hull. It tears through into the forward engine room. The destroyer shudders. Power flickers. Her speed drops from 34 knots to 28. To any other captain, this would signal disengagement. Evans does the opposite. He orders harder attack angles. He orders gunners to keep firing, pushes the boilers even damaged to keep chasing the enemy because now Johnston has become more than a destroyer. She has become a blockade of time itself. She is the cork in the bottle. She is the thing in the way, and the Japanese pilot circling above will later report that they had never seen anything like a destroyer already hit, still coming forward. The shock intensifies, and in the next phase of the battle as the Japanese redirect heavier guns and shift their focus, the fight reaches the point where the line between survival and sacrifice disappears. Johnston is now limping at reduced speed 23 knots but still maneuvering. Japanese shells walk closer. Gun crews keep firing. Smoke generators keep pouring white clouds into the sky. And Evans, wounded in the face by shell splinters, refuses to step back from the bridge. He wipes blood with his sleeve. He keeps shouting orders. There is no pause, because another threat is emerging. The escort carrier Gambier Bay, slowest in Sprague's group, is beginning to lag behind. The Japanese cruisers are adjusting fire to isolate her. If Gambier Bay falls behind further, she dies. Evans sees it. He changes Johnston's position, again not to save his ship but to block the firing path toward Gambier Bay. He literally interposes Johnston's hull to draw fire away. That is not a metaphor. That is literal geometry. The destroyer places herself into the line of fire to absorb attention and receive hits so that the carrier can buy more distance eastward. At their 8:05, Johnston's gun crews shifted to rapid fire. They pour shells directly at a Japanese cruiser trying to close on Gambier Bay. One American sailor would later say, "We were firing like we were trying to set the ocean on fire." Shell after shell after shell hammer the forward superstructure of a cruiser, and the cruiser flinches. Johnston is bleeding from multiple hits. Pumps are struggling. Engine output is unstable, but she is still dictating Japanese maneuver. And this is where Japanese pilots up above begin transmitting back to their own fleet the most important emotional detail of the entire battle. That destroyer is not breaking off. In Japanese cultural framing, this is extraordinary. Ships are supposed to protect themselves. Ships are supposed to preserve survival. Johnston is doing the opposite. She is racing into fire even when death is mathematically certain. And this is the moment where the Japanese formation begins to lose coherence. Yamato, having finally aligned her monstrous main battery, fires a full salvo, 0.1 inch. Shells scream into the sky. The shockwave is so violent that some Japanese pilots feel the concussion. Through their aircraft frames, those shells are aimed not at Johnston but at Gambier Bay. Yamato's guns were built to kill carriers. Her shells slam the water around Gambier Bay, tearing enormous columns into the air. And at 08:20, Gambier Bay is bracketed and takes multiple hits. Her speed collapses. She slows to a crawl. Japanese shells tear through. Her thin hull plating, she begins to list. Her flight deck burns. Her engines choke. She is done. Sprague transmits the terrible message that Gambier Bay is going down. The first escort carrier in U.S. naval history to be sunk by surface gunfire. Johnston's CIC hears that message. They know they failed to save her, but even in failing to save her, they bought time for 5 others. The enemy line is still not in firing position on the rest. Evans wounded orders. Johnston forward again. He is now fighting with almost no advantage left. He is blind in spots. He has lost radar. His ship is running partly on backup circuits. But he still has one thing left: the ability to force Japanese ships to shoot at him. He orders smoke again to hide the fleeing carriers. He orders the main battery to fire on another cruiser closing from the south. And Johnston, badly damaged, turns back toward the Japanese for another gunnery run. Her gunners, some firing manually now, continue to throw 5-inch shells with savage precision. They hit that cruiser's topside radar. They shared her director's rangefinders. For a second time, Japanese fire control was disrupted. And now, Japanese pilots witnessing this finally process the inversion. The smallest ship is causing the greatest effect. They were trained to think American technology was superior because of size, because of production, because of industry. They were not trained to comprehend American aggression that was this raw. At 09:05, Johnston is hit again, this time by a cruiser's 8-inch shell that slams into her starboard side, tearing open bulkheads and severing electrical control to aft turrets. The destroyer shudders again, then slows. She is now under 20 knots. She is now bleeding badly. She cannot maneuver the way she must to survive. At 09:20, a secondary hit floods her stern. Steering becomes sluggish. Evans orders to abandon ship only when he knows the carriers have cleared the range. He waits until the strategic objective has been achieved, until those ships behind him have fully escaped. Then, and only then, does he give up his own life. He is last seen on Johnston's fantail still, shouting for his men to get overboard, still trying to save anyone he can. Johnston sinks at 09:45. She disappears beneath the Pacific, and Japanese pilots overhead watching that destroyer die radio back the message that would later appear in post-war histories. That American destroyer fought like a wounded bear. That was not a metaphor, that was eyewitness shock. Johnston died, but she took pieces of cruisers with her. She tore the Japanese firing plan wide open, and she forced the biggest guns in the Pacific. War to waste irreplaceable minutes that the Americans then converted into survival and victory in Leyte. Her death was not heroic mythology. Her death had strategic weight when the smoke finally began to dissipate, and the Japanese fleet reformed after their chaotic, confused attack. The American escort carriers they came to kill were already over the horizon. They had slipped east into an empty ocean under the protective screen bought by destroyers who should never have survived more than 5 minutes. The Japanese surface fleet, after inflicting such terrifying damage, retreated. They turned away. They were not stopped by American battleships. They were not halted by American carriers. They were not blocked by a heavier force. They retreated because they thought they were fighting a much larger fleet than they actually were. And the reason, they believed that was because of the ferocity of those destroyer counterattacks, because Johnston, Heermann, Hoel were not behaving like escorts. They were behaving like hunters. Captured Japanese officers were asked later, "Why did you turn back when you still had the advantage?" Their reply was brutal in its honesty. The Americans always counterattacked, not retreated, not slipped away, not run, counterattacked. The psychological effect of seeing destroyers rush into 18-inch guns not away from them shattered the Japanese assumption that the enemy was broken. To their minds, that kind of rage only happens when you have powerful reserves behind you. They believed genuinely that Halsey's fast carriers must be just beyond the horizon. They were wrong. There was nobody behind those destroyers. It was all a bluff made of aggression and smoke. Yamato never fired her main battery at an actual American fleet carrier again. She never again achieved a similar firing position. This battle was her last real chance. Leyte Gulf is the last time a battleship fired her guns in an attempt to sink enemy carriers the old-fashioned way, and the ship that prevented that turning into Catastrophe was not a battleship, not a cruiser, not even a fleet carrier. It was a small, 2,100-ton destroyer built on a shipyard schedule, manned by kids barely old enough to vote who fought literally until she could no longer float. When the battle reports were collected, when survivor interviews were written down, when the Navy tried to reconstruct the timeline, there was a grim consistency. Johnston did not simply sink. She fought to the last breath. Her engines are burning. Her radar was destroyed. Her superstructure collapsed, yet she was still maneuvering, and still firing even after most ships her size would have been dead in the water. Multiple Japanese destroyers later filed battle damage claims from Johnston's late-stage salvos. This is not a legend. This is not patriotic exaggeration. This is in the Japanese reports. Even while she was dying, she kept hurting the enemy. The final confirmed moment came around 09:45 hours. Johnston, drifting, burning, listing, finally lost all power. The order to abandon ship was given. Survivors said the Pacific looked dark green and metallic, stained with oil. Men climbed over the side and floated away, clinging to cork floats, debris, and life rafts, waiting for a rescue that would take 2 days to reach them. 2 days. Exposure killed many. Sharks took some. Salt water, diesel fuel ingestion, and wounds took the rest. Many of the crew who survived gunfire died in the water later. The U.S. Navy would later describe the survival window after Samar as one of the cruelest in the Pacific. Ernest Evans did not survive. No one saw him die. Was last seen wounded on deck, giving orders, still encouraging gunners. Then he disappeared in the chaos. When the Navy wrote his Medal of Honor citation, it included a phrase rarely used: indomitable fighting spirit. He was the only Native American naval officer to receive the Medal of Honor in World War II. He earned it on a day when his ship should have run, but instead charged. At first, the battle was overshadowed by the sheer size of Leyte Gulf. But among naval tacticians, among carrier strike planners, among destroyer doctrine writers, Samar became a reference point, a turning point. The U.S. Navy quietly changed internal doctrine after studying Johnston, Hoel, and Heermann. Destroyers could not simply protect, they must be able to ambush. They must be built mentally, not just physically, to punch upward, to take on forces much larger than themselves. It reshaped Cold War thinking. It shaped missile destroyer doctrine. It influenced how the U.S. builds naval captains today. Aggression, not avoidance, buys time. And time is the most valuable currency in naval warfare. It did not prove the superiority of one weapon over another. It did not declare battleships obsolete in a single stroke. It did not magically rewrite physics or armor or tonnage tables. What it proved was far more uncomfortable. It proved that war is shaped most by human will. Small ships, tiny thin-skinned destroyers not even meant to fight capital ships, can alter grand strategy if the people inside them refuse to behave the way the enemy expects. Samar revealed that technology matters. Fire control matters. Ammunition type matters, but decision-making under fear matters most. When Ernest Evans ordered a charge, every calculation said it was impossible, but by acting like it was possible, he made it possible enough to change the course of the battle. In the decades after the war, naval academies taught Samar as a tactical anomaly, but quiet, honest instructors, the ones who remembered, taught it as something else. A psychological victory. The kind that lives longer than ships, longer than fleets, longer than wars. The kind that changes how future enemies perceive American resolve. Because for the Japanese pilots in that moment, stunned, disoriented, the sight of a destroyer charging into them was not heroic, it was terrifying, it told them. They were fighting a nation that would not collapse when logic said collapse was inevitable. Samar stands in naval history as a reminder: firepower wins battles. Courage decides which way history bends. The Pacific swallowed the USS Johnston, but it could not swallow what she represented. In every small ship that refuses to back down, in every captain who chooses aggression when survival demands retreat, a little piece of Samar still lives. And when future historians write about the turning points of the Pacific War, they will always return to the same conclusion, that on one improbable morning in 1944, a single U.S. destroyer did more than fight off a squadron. It changed the meaning of fear itself.